May 15, 1945, Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The announcement was supposed to be a formality, nothing more than a final administrative step in the long unwinding of a global war. American officers stood at the front of the assembly hall with clipboards in hand, reading off names with the same steady precision they had used for 2 years. Outside, the spring sun warmed the parade grounds, the flag snapped in the breeze, and somewhere nearby a baseball thudded softly into a catcher's mitt. To the guards, it felt like the beginning of peace. Inside the room, it felt like the end of the world. Captain Robert S. Merrill cleared his throat, raised the list, and spoke the words that should have brought relief. "Ladies, you are to be repatriated. You will return to Germany within the month. Prepare to—" He never finished the sentence. 14 German women, standing in 2 neat rows before him, began to buckle as though an invisible weight had fallen onto their shoulders. One dropped to her knees first, then another, then the rest, almost in unison. Their hands trembled. Their faces lifted in desperation, not gratitude. And then came the whisper, "Please, we want to stay." The room froze. Even the ceiling fan seemed to stop mid-turn. The young American corporal at the door stared, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Enemy prisoners begging not for release, but for captivity. Captain Merrill lowered the clipboard slowly. He had seen combat in North Africa, had watched men cling to life in desert foxholes, had heard every manner of plea from prisoners and soldiers alike. But never this. Not from German soldiers. Not from German women. "Why would you want to stay?" he asked quietly. But none of them could speak. Their lips trembled, their throats tightened, and their eyes glistened with something far heavier than fear. They weren't fighting for life. They were fighting for the right to remain in the hands of the very country they had once been told would destroy them. Outside, the camp hummed with the ordinary rhythm of an America at its wartime peak. Trucks loaded with crates rumbled along the gravel paths. Young GIs in olive drab moved briskly between barracks, carrying out duties with the practiced confidence of a nation that knew it was on the winning side of history. Beyond the fences stretched the vastness of Massachusetts farmland, green, orderly, abundant. It was a strange contrast to the scene unfolding in the hall, a country bursting with life while the very people who once called it an enemy clung to it as their last hope. No one expected this reaction. Repatriation was supposed to be the final mercy, a gift. The war had ended in Europe just a week earlier. Crowds in Times Square had cheered until midnight. Factories still roared with production even as victory loomed, and the whole country felt as if the Great Depression had finally been buried under mountains of steel, wheat, and determination. America had never been stronger, never been more united, never been more certain of its purpose in the world. And now, these German women, these former auxiliaries who had once served under the swastika, were begging America not to send them home. The guards exchanged confused glances. They knew enough of the women's backstories to understand the fear lurking behind their eyes. Bombed cities, missing families, starvation, the cold uncertainty of whatever Germany had become after surrender. But still, to choose captivity over freedom, to choose America over home, that was something none of them had anticipated. In the back row, a young translator named Ingrid Weber lifted her chin. She had always carried herself with a certain poise, shoulders straight, posture perfect, a habit formed long before captivity. But now her voice cracked. "Captain," she said, "we have nothing in Germany. No homes, no families, no food. Here." She swallowed. "Here, we were treated as human beings." The simplicity of the statement struck harder than any speech. Not once in all the propaganda they had been raised on had the idea even been entertained that the enemy could show mercy, that a nation across the ocean, a nation of cowboys and factories and abundance, could extend kindness even to those who had once served its enemy. Captain Merrill felt something shift in the room. Not sympathy, something deeper, something older, a reminder of who Americans believed themselves to be. He had grown up on stories of his father's generation, the men who survived the Great War, who built schools and farms and businesses during the Dust Bowl, who raised families through hardship without losing their sense of decency. And now, here he was, watching the children of America's enemy kneel on American soil because they had found refuge under the care of his own countrymen. A single thought crossed his mind. This is the America we were taught to believe in. Outside, a train horn sounded, the daily supply run bringing food, letters, medical kits, and uniforms. During the war, those trains had carried a nation's beating heart, thousands of tons of grain, steel, and machinery, enough to feed and clothe millions of soldiers, enough to feed even the enemy. Greatest generation mothers had sewn bandages for strangers they would never meet. American farmers had grown so much wheat and beef that even POW camps received meals far richer than what Europe's civilians ate. And now, the consequences of that extraordinary generosity stood kneeling on the floor, begging not to leave it behind. The paradox was staggering. Enemy prisoners were safer, healthier, and better fed in American custody than in their own shattered homeland. No wonder they were terrified to go back. Captain Merrill folded the orders slowly, his jaw tightening. There were procedures to follow, laws, diplomatic expectations. But at that moment they felt small compared to the raw truth in front of him, a group of defeated young women who had discovered humanity not in victory, but in the hands of their captors. He took a step forward. "Stand up," he said gently. The women hesitated. Then, with shaky legs, they rose one by one. "You're not going anywhere today." A breath escaped the room, part relief, part disbelief. Outside, the American flag billowed in the warm May air. And somewhere deep inside every American who would later hear this story, a quiet pride began to stir. Pride in a country that had been strong enough to be merciful, rich enough to be generous, and confident enough to treat even its enemies with dignity. The kind of pride that whispers, "That was the America we once were." Long before Ingrid Weber knelt on American soil and begged not to be sent home, she had been someone very different. The girl who once believed in the Reich's iron promises had not yet seen the world burn. She had not yet tasted hunger sharp enough to hollow the ribs or watched whole cities dissolve under firestorms. She certainly had not imagined that the enemy, America, would one day treat her with a gentleness her own nation no longer remembered. But in 1943 and 1944, the war had pressed its truce upon her one by one, each harsher than the last. Ingrid had grown up in Hamburg, in an apartment overlooking the Elbe River, where her father managed a shipping office and her mother taught piano. She'd been a quiet girl, steady-handed, serious, with a gift for languages. At 17, she volunteered for the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Corps, not because she hated anyone, but because she believed she was doing something meaningful. The Reich promised duty, structure, purpose. It promised that Germany was surrounded by enemies, all waiting to tear it apart, and that she must help defend the fatherland from barbaric invaders. In training, instructors repeated the same message daily. Americans were crude, violent, undisciplined, and cruel. They tortured prisoners. They mutilated bodies. They treated women worse than animals. Death was better than falling into their hands. Better to die than to be taken alive. It was a refrain whispered so often it began to echo through her dreams. Then came the war itself. By 1944, the skies over Hamburg turned black with Allied bombers. Ingrid spent nights in cellars listening to beams crack and masonry groan as entire streets vanished beneath pillars of fire. Food grew scarce. Bread shrank into thin gray slices. Butter disappeared. Coffee became a bitter brew of roasted barley. Children cried from hunger, their mothers unable to soothe them. And still the propaganda insisted, hold on, fight, victory is near. But victory was nowhere near. It was retreat that approached, swift and merciless. In June, after the collapse in Normandy, Ingrid's radio post near Rouen fell silent. Communications broke down, supplies failed to arrive. Survivors staggered in from shattered units, their uniforms torn, their faces gaunt, their eyes reflecting something unspoken. It's over. Ingrid and the other auxiliaries received orders to fall back toward Paris. They boarded trucks, then abandoned them when fuel ran out. By August, they were marching on foot. And still, every encounter with civilians, every bomb-shattered town, every burned-out train yard drove home a truth she did not dare speak aloud. Germany had lost the war long before it admitted defeat. Hunger wrapped around her like a second skin. Some nights she barely slept, her stomach twisting in knots, gnawing at memories of meals she once took for granted. The ration biscuits she carried crumbled into dust. Rainwater collected in her canteen tasted like metal. When the Americans finally caught up with their column outside Chartres, Ingrid did exactly what she had been trained to do. She braced for the end. The tanks rolled toward them along the tree-lined road, engines growling, their barrels pointed straight at the exhausted stragglers in gray uniforms. American infantry fanned out with crisp efficiency, taller, broader, stronger than she had imagined, their boots and equipment immaculate. They were nothing like the weak, soft caricatures shown in German propaganda. Ingrid's pulse hammered in her ears. She whispered the familiar words one last time. Better to die. But no bullet came. Instead, the Americans shouted orders she didn't understand, lowered their rifles, and motioned for the Germans to sit. A medic approached a wounded auxiliary 2 places beside her, knelt, and began bandaging a gash on her calf. Another GI handed a trembling woman a canteen. Ingrid stared, uncomprehending. This wasn't what she had been taught. No one struck them. No one screamed. No one dragged them away. The American moved with calmness that felt dreamlike, infuriatingly gentle, as if they had captured not enemies but exhausted travelers who had simply lost their way. That night, in the temporary holding area, Ingrid lay awake listening to the Americans talk by their jeeps. Their voices were relaxed, almost cheerful, even though they had spent months fighting through France. One of them laughed as he told a story about his mother sending him socks. Another wrote a letter home. It was a strange thing to realize that her supposed enemy still had the luxury of laughter. The next days revealed an even starker contrast. One not just between soldiers, but between entire worlds. Europe in 1944 was a skeleton of itself. Cities smoldered. Refugees staggered down roads with what little they could carry. Children scavenged in ruins. Factories stood silent, bombed into rubble. Crops rotted in fields. People boiled weeds to survive. Ingrid had seen mothers faint from hunger. She had watched boys younger than 15 conscripted and thrown into battle. She had seen soldiers fight with half-empty stomachs, wearing boots patched so many times the leather barely held together. But America was something else entirely. She had glimpsed it in fragments during the march to Captivity. Long trains loaded with crates, vehicles stacked on flat cars, machinery gleaming under the sun. At night, she saw searchlights sweeping over rail yards packed with locomotives, more than Germany possessed in entire regions. She didn't know the numbers then, but years later she would learn them. 96,000 aircraft built in a single year. Million tons of ships launched from American ports, factories running day and night without pause, fields so vast they could feed nations. Ingrid heard American soldiers joke that there's more wheat in Kansas than people in Germany. At first, she thought it was bravado. She would later realize it was barely an exaggeration. The deeper they traveled into Captivity, the more the contrast grew unbearable. When the trucks finally neared the gates of Fort Devens months later, Ingrid felt the familiar spike of dread rise in her chest. The barbed wire, the guard towers, the warning signs, they all screamed danger. Everything she'd been taught came rushing back at once. This is where the torture begins. This is where they show their true face. This is where the propaganda becomes real. Her hands shook as she stepped off the truck. She could barely breathe. The guards waited in formation. Tall, broad-shouldered Americans in clean uniforms, watching silently as the prisoners gathered. One of them lifted a clipboard, preparing to read names and assignments. Another adjusted his helmet and spit dust from his mouth. To Ingrid, their calmness was terrifying. She imagined hidden cruelty behind it, discipline masking brutality. She pictured interrogation rooms, electric wires, and cold basements. She braced for humiliation. But the moment she stepped into the intake building, something unexpected happened. A Red Cross nurse approached her, lifted her chin gently, and examined a bruise near her temple. "We'll get that cleaned up," the woman said softly, her accent distinctly New England. A medic handed her a cup of water. A clerk asked her name, not with hostility but with routine politeness. A female guard offered a wool blanket and pointed her toward a barracks. There were no dogs, no beatings, no shouting, only procedure, only order, only humanity. And that was what terrified Ingrid the most, because nothing she had ever believed prepared her for kindness. The first act of kindness came before Ingrid could even begin to understand what American captivity truly meant. It happened on her second morning at Fort Devens, so quickly, so quietly, that for years she would remember it not as a grand event, but as the moment her entire world-view cracked. She had woken before dawn, curled beneath a thin wool blanket issued the night before. In Germany, blankets had become a luxury during the final months of the war. Here, the wool scratched her skin, but it was warm. That warmth unsettled her more than the cold ever had. Kindness, she believed, was always followed by cruelty. Nothing in her upbringing suggested that comfort could be given without a hidden purpose. When the bugle sounded outside and the barracks stirred to life, Ingrid followed the line of German women toward the mess hall. She walked stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her, every instinct warning her to move carefully, to avoid eye contact, to expect the worst. The smell met her before she reached the door, salty, smoky, rich in a way she had nearly forgotten. Bacon, eggs, bread baking. Her stomach tightened instantly, but a rush of fear drowned the hunger. She remembered the broadcasts. Americans feed prisoner scraps. Americans starve them slowly. Americans make them beg. The line moved forward. When Ingrid reached the front, she braced for a slap, for shouted orders, for humiliation. Instead, a man with sandy hair and a red bandana tied around his neck looked her over with a friendly squint. "Morning, ma'am," he said as though greeting a neighbor. "You look like you could use something warm." Before she could react, he ladled scrambled eggs onto her tray, added 2 strips of bacon, and set a small cup of steaming coffee beside them. The coffee alone felt like a hallucination. She had not tasted real coffee since 1942. The ersatz substitute in Germany had made her gag. She stared at the tray as though it were a trap. The cook noticed. "Ain't poisoned," he added casually. "Just breakfast." Around her, the other German women stood frozen, clutching their trays with the same wide-eyed disbelief. A few muttered prayers under their breath. One of them began to cry quietly, tears sliding down her cheeks as she tasted bacon for the first time in years. Ingrid took her tray to the long wooden table and sat down. Her hands shook around the fork. She tasted a piece of bacon, expecting bitterness, expecting something inedible. But it was warm, crispy, salty, real. A warmth rose in her chest, but she pushed it down violently. She reminded herself that this was the enemy. This was a country that had dropped bombs on her home. This was a kitchen that should have served humiliation instead of hospitality. Why are they doing this? Why aren't they punishing us? What do they want from us? The questions tangled in her mind like barbed wire. Later that morning, during medical inspection, the contradictions deepened. The American nurse returned, the same woman who had examined the bruise on her temple the day before. "You took a fall before capture, didn't you?" she asked. Ingrid stiffened. She expected accusation, humiliation, perhaps an interrogation. Instead, the nurse gently guided her to a chair and cleaned the faint cut along her hairline. "You'll be fine," she murmured, almost motherly. "Just a bit of swelling." Her touch was careful, controlled, respectful. Why does she care? Why isn't she angry? When the nurse finished, she placed a small packet of bandages and aspirin in Ingrid's hand. "If the headache gets worse, let us know," she said. "Let us know, not report to medical authorities, not obey orders, just a simple human offer of help." It was the second crack in the wall. The third came that afternoon when the work detail assembled in the courtyard. A tall American corporal approached the group, his posture easy, his expression neutral. He looked like the sort of man Ingrid had been taught to fear. Strong, confident, physically imposing, the embodiment of the decadent American bully that German radios mocked. But when one of the German women tripped stepping off the platform, he reached out instantly and caught her by the arm. "You all right, miss?" he asked, steadying her. No anger, no blame, just concern. The woman nodded nervously, and the corporal offered a small nod in return. Ingrid watched closely. Something wasn't adding up. She wanted to distrust it. She wanted to cling to the certainty that enemies remained enemies. But the evidence mounting before her eyes contradicted everything she had ever believed. She tried telling herself, "This is all a strategy. They want something from us. They're hiding their cruelty." But the Americans weren't hiding anything. They were simply normal, decent, busy with work, focused on procedures, built from a culture that valued politeness as reflex, not calculation. At dinner, the contradiction sharpened further. A guard paused by their table. He didn't hover like a watchman. He stood like a host checking on guests. "Everything all right here?" he asked. The German women stared at him silently. He nodded once, satisfied, and walked away. It wasn't cruelty that unsettled Ingrid. It was the absence of it. Over the weeks that followed, she learned more about the strange country she had fallen into. America, in 1944 and 1945, was unlike anything the Germans had imagined. It was a nation shaped by church pews, Sunday dinners, farmhouses, community halls, and an unspoken rule that neighbors took care of one another. While Europe rationed turnips and bread crusts, America harvested mountains of corn and wheat. While German factories lay in ruins, American plants produced airplanes at a rate that defied the imagination, one every 5 minutes. Ships launched from coastal yards every day. Trains ran constantly delivering food, equipment, uniforms, and sometimes, astonishingly, even luxuries. This abundance wasn't arrogance. It was responsibility, something the Americans saw as their duty, not their privilege. Ingrid heard some of the guards speak about rationing at home, meatless Tuesdays, sugar limits, gasoline coupons. Yet not once did she hear anyone complain that German prisoners received the same food. When one POW asked a guard why they didn't resent feeding the enemy, the young man shrugged. "My brother's overseas," he said. "If he got captured, I'd sure want them to treat him right." That was the moment Ingrid realized what she was truly confronting. American kindness wasn't weakness. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't strategy. It was culture. It was upbringing. It was faith. It was prosperity. It was confidence so deep-rooted it didn't need cruelty to assert itself. Her world view, carefully shaped by propaganda, began to wobble under the weight of something far more powerful than ideology: human decency. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the Massachusetts tree line, Ingrid sat outside the barracks and watched children from a nearby town toss a baseball back and forth. Their fathers were at war. Their mothers managed homes alone. Their brothers served on ships somewhere in the Pacific. Nearly every family bore a sacrifice, and yet none of those children looked at her with hate. They didn't even look afraid. They waved. She hesitated, then raised her hand in return. Something inside her shifted, quiet but irrevocable. She had been taught to fear these people. Then she had been taught to hate them. Now she was beginning to understand them. That understanding frightened her more than anything she had faced on the battlefield. Because kindness, she realized, is far more dangerous to hatred than violence. And the danger had only just begun. Ingrid's transformation did not arrive in a single revelation. It came gently, in the rhythm of days that were supposed to feel like captivity, but instead unfolded like a strange, peaceful interlude. Something between a farm apprenticeship and an unexpected second life. The routines at Fort Devens were simple, consistent, and, above all, humane. At first, Ingrid followed them with mechanical obedience, still waiting for the cruelty she had been promised. But cruelty never came. Instead, there were mornings that began with the sound of a bugle and the smell of hot oatmeal, and evenings that ended with tired laughter drifting across the compound. The library was her first surprise. She expected a room full of propaganda pamphlets or strict military manuals. Instead, she found shelves lined with Dickens, Steinbeck, Goethe, even a German translation of Little Women. American soldiers browsed the same shelves during their free hours. Some nodded to her politely. One private even pointed out a shelf of grammar books, as though inviting her to study English without ever saying the words. English classes were offered twice a week in the recreation hall. The instructor, a middle-aged sergeant with ink-stained fingers, taught patiently, correcting their pronunciation without mockery. Ingrid learned simple phrases first. "Good morning." "Thank you." "I understand." She had always loved language, and she found herself absorbing new vocabulary faster than she expected. Soon, she was helping other German women decode newspapers and radio broadcasts. Sports came next. Once the shock of captivity faded, the guards encouraged outdoor games, softball, volleyball, even soccer, which the Americans watched with amused confusion. Ingrid was not athletic, but she enjoyed sitting along the fence, watching the others run across open fields. Laughter, real, unguarded laughter, began returning to faces that had been clenched with fear only weeks earlier. Medical care was another contradiction she could not ignore. The American infirmary treated prisoners with the same diligence as soldiers. Ingrid had a persistent cough from months of cold barracks in France, and when she visited the infirmary, the doctor listened carefully to her lungs, gave her real medication, and told her to return in 2 days. She remembered her mother waiting months to see a doctor in Hamburg, only to receive diluted remedies that barely eased the pain. 3 meals a day became routine: scrambled eggs or oatmeal in the morning, sandwiches or stew at noon, and hearty dinners: meatloaf, potatoes, sometimes chicken at night. On Sundays, dessert appeared: stewed peaches, chocolate pudding, or a slice of apple pie that tasted like something from a family kitchen rather than a military installation. Ingrid often caught herself staring at her tray in disbelief. Back home, her mother had split ration cards into careful portions, slicing bread so thin it curled at the edges, saving fat drippings in jars. Here, the abundance felt almost embarrassing, almost shameful, and yet overwhelmingly comforting. Work assignments took Ingrid outside the fences. Local farmers requested POW labor through the War Manpower Commission, and once the background checks cleared, the prisoners were allowed to help in fields, orchards, and barns under the supervision of a single guard. The first time Ingrid was taken to a farm, she couldn't stop staring at the vastness of the land. Fields rolled outward in every direction, dotted with barns painted in bright reds and whites. Rows of corn stretched toward the horizon. Cattle grazed lazily under an open sky far larger than anything she had seen in Europe. The farmer who greeted them was an older man named Harold Miller. He wore denim overalls, a straw hat, and had the calm demeanor of someone who had worked under sun and weather his entire life. When Ingrid approached, he nodded and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, glad for the help. His politeness stunned her more than the landscape. No German farmer would have greeted a prisoner so gently, not after years of war and loss. The work was tiring but honest: stacking hay, cleaning stalls, collecting eggs. Ingrid found a rhythm to it, and soon she noticed something unexpected: the way American families worked together. Mothers, sons, daughters all shared tasks without complaint. When lunchtime came, Mrs. Miller brought sandwiches and lemonade for everyone, including the POWs. She even handed Ingrid an extra cookie for energy. Children from nearby houses often wandered toward the fence, staring at the German women with curiosity rather than fear. One little girl offered Ingrid a dandelion through the wire. "For you," she whispered. Ingrid accepted it with a trembling smile. In the evenings back at the camp, radio music drifted from the recreation hall. Swing tunes, big band melodies, and the warm, steady voice of Bing Crosby, singing "I'll Be Seeing You." Later came Hank Williams and the beginnings of country music, sounds Ingrid had never heard before, yet somehow found soothing. Sometimes the guards let the prisoners listen before lights out. Ingrid sat cross-legged on the floor with the other women, letting the music wash over her. There was something hopeful in the rhythm, something confident. It felt like the heartbeat of a country untouched by defeat. On rare Sundays, local families invited selected prisoners to join their dinners, supervised but still astonishing. Ingrid attended once, sitting at a long wooden table with a family who treated her not as a criminal but as an unusual guest. They passed plates of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh rolls with butter. The father asked polite questions about her hometown and her family. The mother sent her home with 2 extra cookies for the girls back at the camp. Ingrid returned to the barracks that night overwhelmed, not by fear, but by the warm ache of gratitude she didn't know how to express. What most unsettled her wasn't the food, or the comfort, or the safety. It was the realization that these Americans, whose brothers fought in Europe, whose sons were still bleeding on beaches and forests, had chosen not to hate her. Kindness was not an accident in this country. It was a principle. Treat others the way you want to be treated, Mrs. Miller had said. A simple rule, a powerful one. Every day, Ingrid discovered more of the woven fabric beneath American life. Church gatherings, volunteer efforts, neighbors sharing sugar coupons, families writing letters to soldiers overseas. A society held together not by ideology, but by community, by faith, by a sense that everyone owed something to each other. She found herself watching American families with a quiet longing she didn't dare articulate. Children teased their fathers, wives laughed with husbands, teenagers complained about chores. There was a normalcy here that made Ingrid's chest tighten, a normalcy she had not felt since she was a child, before the Reich taught her to salute flags and chant slogans. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Massachusetts woods, painting the sky in deep oranges and pinks, Ingrid sat outside the barracks and whispered to herself, "So, this is how they live." She wasn't thinking of abundance anymore. She wasn't thinking of victory or defeat. She was thinking of humanity. And somewhere deep in the American heartland, across farms, churches, and camp fences, a nostalgic truth echoed silently. This was the America her captors came from, and the two. It is an America her captors hoped to return to, a country of kindness, unity, and overwhelming decency. The kind of America a POW could begin to trust, the kind of America a POW might one day refuse to leave. The moment of breaking didn't come suddenly. It built slowly within Ingrid, day after day, kindness after kindness, until the weight of it became too heavy to hold. But when it finally arrived, it happened in a way so small, so ordinary, that only later would she understand its enormity. It happened on a warm afternoon in September. The POW work detail had been sent once again to the Miller farm, where the late summer sun hung low over the fields and the air smelled of cut hay. Ingrid had grown comfortable with the rhythm of these days, comfort that still frightened her. Every time Mr. Miller greeted her with a "Good morning, ma'am," she felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Every time Mrs. Miller handed her a glass of lemonade, Ingrid wondered how many German mothers were boiling weeds in ruined kitchens. That day the work was simple, carrying crates of apples to the back porch. Ingrid had grown stronger since arriving, her face no longer gaunt, her posture more confident. She moved steadily between the orchard and the porch, her breath matching the rise and fall of the late summer heat. She didn't notice the tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her throat, or the familiar instinct to remain vigilant. Years of war had taught her to brace for shouting, for punishment, for the sudden snap of violence. Even surrounded by peace, her mind still waited for danger. When the last crate was stacked, Mr. Miller stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a towel. His voice carried the casual ease of someone who had lived his entire life under a sky that never knew war. "Come on now," he said, gesturing toward the porch table. "You girls worked hard today. Sit down. Eat with us." Ingrid froze. 3 years of propaganda screamed through her mind. Americans humiliate prisoners. Americans despise Germans. Americans would never break bread with the enemy. Her breath hitched. She felt the sting of cold air inside her chest even though the afternoon was warm. The other women hesitated too, but then Mrs. Miller appeared, carrying a platter of sandwiches and waving them forward with the gentle insistence of a mother guiding tired children. "Don't be shy," she said. "Food's better when shared." The absurdity, the generosity, the impossible normalcy of it all pressed like a fist against Ingrid's ribs. She sat at the table. The wood was warm beneath her palms. The sandwiches smelled of ham and mustard. A pitcher of sweet tea glistened with condensation. She couldn't move. Mr. Miller filled her glass as though she were one of his daughters. "You're doing good work," he said kindly. "We appreciate it." The words cut deeper than he knew. Not long ago, German broadcasts had described Americans as beasts with no honor, brutes who reveled in cruelty, monsters who would treat German women worse than animals. Yet here she sat, a uniformed enemy, sharing lunch with a family whose sons were fighting people like her brother, a family who had every reason to despise her, yet they chose decency. They chose grace. She stared at her plate. The edges blurred. Her throat tightened. How could they be like this? How could kindness come so easily to them? Why would they offer comfort to someone who once wished their country harm? A child's voice broke the silence. It was Sarah, the Miller's youngest daughter, no more than 7. She wandered onto the porch carrying a small stuffed rabbit with a missing ear. Her blonde braids bounced as she skipped toward the table. Without hesitation, without fear, the girl climbed into Ingrid's lap. "Daddy says you're from far away," Sarah said, her voice bright. "Do you have farms where you live?" Ingrid opened her mouth, but no words came. The child's trust undid her. It slipped under all her defenses, past every wall she had built, through every layer of indoctrination, and struck her at the core of who she was. The girl reached up and touched a strand of Ingrid's hair. "You're nice," she said with total innocence. "Nice." The word broke something loose inside her. She tried to hold herself together. She clenched her jaw until it ached. She blinked hard, forcing her vision to steady. But the tears came anyway, flooding, unstoppable, humiliating in their honesty. Her shoulders shook. Her breath collapsed inward. She bowed her head, trying to hide it, but it was too late. Mrs. Miller set her hand gently on Ingrid's back. "It's all right, dear," she murmured. "You're safe." Safe. Another word she hadn't felt in years. The dam burst completely. Ingrid wept, silently at first, then with soft, choking sobs that carried all the weight of the war she had endured. Hunger, fear, bombs, propaganda, loss, the shame of what Germany had become, the terror of having no home left to return to, the shock of finding humanity where she had been told none existed, and beneath it all, one overwhelming realization. The enemy has treated me like a person. She cried for the strangeness of it. She cried for the kindness she couldn't repay. She cried for the realization that her captors had shown more mercy than the nation she once served. Mr. Miller looked away politely, giving her dignity. Mrs. Miller stayed beside her. The child held her hand as though nothing in the world was wrong. It was a breakdown, but not the kind the Reich had warned her of. Not torture, not despair. A breakdown born from mercy. From that day forward, nothing inside Ingrid was the same. She could no longer pretend the Americans were hiding cruelty. She could no longer cling to the lies she'd been raised on. She could no longer see herself as an enemy deserving punishment. Because these people, these farmers, cooks, guards, and children, had never treated her as one. They showed kindness not for applause, not for advantage, not for image. It wasn't strategic, it wasn't performative. It was simply who they were. This was America at its moral height, a nation strong enough to be gentle, prosperous enough to be generous, united enough to see dignity even in an enemy uniform. Watching from afar, modern Americans might feel that familiar ache. We used to be this country. We used to be this people. We used to believe kindness was a strength, not a weakness. And for the POWs like Ingrid, that realization was more powerful than any weapon. It broke them, but it also began to remake them. In the weeks after her breakdown on the Miller porch, Ingrid found herself moving through the camp with a new awareness, like someone walking through a familiar room and suddenly seeing colors she'd never noticed before. Nothing about Fort Devens had changed. The guards still tipped their hats politely. The meals still arrived on schedule. The fields still glowed gold in late afternoon light. But she had changed. The lies she'd been raised on, the certainty that Americans were brutal, soulless enemies, no longer held any weight. The truth had come not from grand gestures or speeches, but from small, ordinary acts of decency. And now, each of those moments echoed inside her with painful clarity. She began writing letters home. They were censored, of course, but the censors could never catch what mattered most, the truth buried between the lines. She wrote slowly, choosing her words with care, her pen trembling over the paper. Liebe Mama, I do not know if this will reach you, or even if you are alive to read it. But if it does, I want you to know something important. She paused, trying to steady her breath. They treat us well here. Better than I ever expected. Better than we treated one another in the last years of the war. Another pause. I was wrong about the Americans. We all were. She hesitated, remembering burned streets, bodies in cellars. The night Hamburg glowed as though the sky itself had caught fire. She remembered the Reich's broadcasts promising victory even as children starved 3 blocks from their radios. Here. They give us food. Real food. Enough food. We work, but we are not beaten. We are given blankets, medicine, even kindness. I do not know why. Perhaps it is their faith. Perhaps it is their prosperity. Perhaps it is simply who they are. She looked over the page, unsure whether to continue. The truth felt dangerous. Dangerous to admit. Dangerous to believe. All I know is this. They treat me with dignity, even though I once wore the uniform of their enemy. She signed the letter with a trembling hand and handed it to the Red Cross clerk, unsure if anyone she loved would ever read it. Meanwhile, word trickled in from Germany. Slowly, painfully, like news carried across the ruins of another planet. Letters arrived sporadically, sometimes months apart, often smudged by rain or ash. With each one, the women learned more of what awaited them back home. Hamburg, her city, was gone. Not damaged, not wounded, gone. Whole districts flattened, streets reduced to rubble and bone dust. Families scattered. Breadlines snaking around buildings that no longer had walls. The once familiar neighborhoods replaced by craters, charred timbers, and the ghosts of those who hadn't made it to shelters in time. One woman received word that her home in Dresden had vanished in the firestorm, along with her parents and 2 brothers. Another learned that her village had been overrun by Soviet troops, and no one knew who was alive. Many letters carried only fragments of sentences. The bakery burned. We sleep in the school cellar now. There is almost no food. Do not come home yet. These messages spread through the barracks like cold wind. Even those who hadn't received letters understood what they meant. Germany was no longer a country with homes waiting for them. It was a graveyard, a landscape of hunger and ruin. Ingrid lay awake many nights, staring at the wooden ceiling beams, thinking of the contrast. Here she slept on a clean cot. In Germany, children slept under collapsed roofs. Here she ate 3 meals a day. In Germany, ration lines stretched for miles. Here she was given medicine, blankets, books. In Germany, people traded heirlooms for a handful of potatoes. Here she was treated with decency, by the very enemy she had been taught to hate. In Germany, she wasn't sure what remained worth returning to. It was in this widening gap, between what she feared and what she experienced, that her moral awakening took shape. For the first time, she began to question not just the Reich, but the culture that had shaped her. The slogans she once chanted felt hollow now. The pride she once carried felt naive. The radio speeches she once believed felt like cruel parodies compared to the quiet kindness of people like the Millers. She asked herself questions she had never dared to consider. Who taught me to fear these people? Who taught me to hate them? And why? Why were the Americans the ones who showed me humanity? It tormented her because the answers came easily. Germany had taught her hate. America had shown her kindness. The realization was so simple yet so devastating that it forced her to re-examine everything she thought she knew about strength, virtue, and civilization. She began observing the Americans more carefully, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. The guards joked with one another even after long shifts. The farmers brought extra sandwiches to share. Children waved at prisoners through fences. On Sundays, church bells rang across the valley and families walked together in their best clothes, the sound of hymnals drifting through open windows. There was no arrogance in their unity, no cruelty in their pure prosperity. Only a steady, quiet confidence, a belief that doing the right thing mattered even when no one was watching. One evening, Ingrid saw a guard kneel beside a fellow soldier whose wife had just sent word from Indiana. The man was crying, unashamedly, grieving the loss of a father he couldn't go home to bury. The guard placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered something comforting, something steadying. That moment stayed with Ingrid. These men, she realized, were not iron symbols of a ruthless empire as German propaganda had painted them. They were sons, brothers, husbands, shaped by homes where kindness was a virtue, not a weakness, by churches that preached mercy, by communities that believed decency was a shared responsibility. And just as she had once judged them wrongly, she now judged her own past with new clarity. Her service uniform, the salutes, the slogans, the obedience, the silence in the face of cruelty. She felt shame for the things she once believed, but she also felt relief that she had survived long enough to learn differently. One night, sitting alone on a bench behind the barracks, she whispered to herself, "I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." It was not a confession of guilt alone. It was an admission of transformation. She now understood the true measure of strength, the kind America demonstrated through generosity rather than domination, through fairness rather than hatred. And as news of post-war tensions, rationing, and political division trickled in from Europe, she felt something unsettling. She did not want to return. Germany was her birthplace, but it no longer felt like home. Home was not ruins. Home was not fear. Home was not ideology. Home was where she had found dignity again. Home was where she had been treated like a person. Home was where strangers had offered kindness freely. Home, she realized, was here. For the American audience witnessing her awakening, there's an unmistakable echo. America was strong enough to be merciful. America once defined itself by decency, unity, and generosity. America's greatest generation lived these values instinctively, without applause, without hesitation. And in the heart of a German prisoner who expected cruelty but instead found compassion, those values sparked a transformation powerful enough to shatter a lifetime of indoctrination. It is impossible to hear her story without feeling a quiet pride, not in victory, but in virtue. The kind of pride that whispers, "This was who we were. This is the America our grandparents built. And this is the America we long to be again." Act 7. The Refusal. Legacy, 800-1,000 words. Narrative only. By the time autumn winds began sweeping through Massachusetts, Ingrid no longer felt like someone in captivity. She moved through Fort Devens with an ease that would have startled the terrified young woman who had arrived months earlier. Her English had improved. The guards greeted her by name. Local families recognized her during Sunday work details and waved from their porches. Even the children who once approached the fence with timid curiosity now ran to her without hesitation. Ingrid had not merely adapted to America. She had begun to belong to it, in small, unexpected, undeniable ways. But the war had been over for months, and bureaucracy does not wait for the heart. On May 15, 1945, the announcement came. The POW camp assembled in the main hall, where sunlight slanted in through tall windows and dust drifted lazily in the air. Captain Robert Merrill stood at the front, holding a clipboard. His tone was official, his posture firm, the kind of firm that meant he expected no surprises. "Ladies," he began, "the time has come for repatriation. Germany has surrendered. You will be processed and returned home within the month." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Some of the women lowered their eyes. Some stared blankly ahead. A few began to tremble. But Ingrid felt something rise in her chest, an ache, then a tightening, and finally a kind of panic she hadn't felt since the night Hamburg burned. She saw it reflected in the faces of the other women, the fear of returning to a place that was no longer home, a place where the sky was still black with smoke, a place where families were gone, cities gone, futures gone. Germany was ashes. Germany was hunger. Germany was loss. But here she had regained her humanity. Before she realized she was speaking, her voice broke through the hall. "Captain, we want to stay." The room went still. The guards froze. Even the ceiling fan seemed to halt mid-turn. Captain Merrill blinked slowly, unsure whether he had heard correctly. "You want to stay?" he repeated. Ingrid stepped forward. Her voice shook, but her spine did not. "We have nothing to return to," she said. "No homes, no families, no safety. Germany is—" She searched for the right word, one that carried the truth without needing embellishment. "Gone." Behind her, other German women murmured softly in agreement. One whispered, "My parents died in Dresden." Another, "My home is rubble." Another, "I have nowhere." Another, "Please, sir, please, we are safe here." These were not the words of prisoners seeking to avoid punishment. They were the words of women who had found dignity, perhaps for the first time, in the hands of their former enemy. Captain Merrill's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from something closer to sorrow. He had children at home, a wife, a warm house that waited for him. The idea that these young women had none of that struck him harder than the battles he'd fought overseas. "I understand," he said quietly. "But repatriation is required. It's international policy." Ingrid shook her head. "Captain, we were treated better here than we were in our own country. You gave us blankets, medicine, work, kindness." Her voice cracked. "You gave us back our dignity." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an entire ruined continent. For a long moment, no one spoke. The American guards, boys from Iowa, Texas, Ohio, stood silently at attention, wrestling with emotions their training had not prepared them for. They had seen war. They had buried friends. They had written letters home for men who would never return. Yet nothing had prepared them for this. Enemy women begging not for mercy, but for permission to remain under their care. Finally, Captain Merrill exhaled slowly. "I will speak to my commanding officer," he said. "I cannot promise anything, but I will try." It was a small hope, but it was hope. The women bowed their heads in gratitude. In the weeks that followed, some found a path to remain longer. A few married American soldiers with special permissions. A few were offered extended stays as civilian workers through post-war labor shortages. Others were denied but left America with letters of recommendation from guards, farmers, and families who had come to care for them deeply. For Ingrid, departure day came with a heaviness she could not shake. The Millers arrived at the train station to say goodbye, Mrs. Miller carrying a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "It's just some bread and cookies for the journey," she said. "I figured you could use something homemade." Ingrid accepted it with trembling hands. Little Sarah hugged her fiercely around the waist, pressing her face into Ingrid's uniform. "Come back someday," she whispered. The words pierced deeper than any wound. When Ingrid boarded the train, she looked out across the platform, at the American families waving, at the guards standing solemnly, at the land that had shown her more humanity than the nation she was born into. She did not cry. Not then, not where anyone could see. But when the train pulled away and the last glimpse of the Miller farm trees vanished behind the hills, tears finally came. Not for what she had lost, but for unexpected grace she had found. Decades later, when historians told these stories, American audiences felt something stir in their chests. A quiet pride, unmistakable and deeply personal. We were the good guys. We were the country that fed the enemy. We were the nation strong enough to be merciful. Grandchildren of POWs wrote letters, left comments on videos, traveled to Texas or Wisconsin to see the camps where their grandfathers or grandmothers had once worked the fields, eaten American dinners, or learned their first English words. My grandfather always said the Americans saved his life. My grandmother cried when she left Texas. She said it felt more like home than Germany. My father told us he owed his survival to the American farmer who treated him like family. These stories carried a strange, bittersweet nostalgia, a longing for an America defined not by division, but by character, by unity, by a quiet, unwavering belief that mercy was not a weakness but a weapon of the moral kind. And in the end, the legacy of Ingrid Weber and thousands like her could be summed up in a single line. A line whispered across generations. A line that belongs to no nation alone, but to the better angels of human nature. They came as enemies. They left as witnesses.